place probably about 1845, 1850, and the other occurred in November of 1860. It's all time in our time machines. We'll go back to 165 years and learn a little bit about what went on. Our first story is called the Battle of Pine Swamp, and it occurred in West Hampton, right near Timbuctoo. Do you all know where Timbuctoo is? Okay. So many fugitives from slavery lie at rest in the burial ground at Timbuctoo, located just west of Mount Laurel. Most of the graves exhibit no enduring monuments. The families being unable to afford lasting memorials probably mark the graves of their loved ones with simple wooden crosses that have since rotted away. While we do not possess a complete list of those interred therein, it is likely that a man named Curry Simmons can be numbered among the dead. Since its founding in 1825 and until 1861, when the South rebelled over the looming crisis of slavery as a states' rights issue, Timbuctoo served as a permanent haven for runaway slaves escaping primarily from Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. They traveled via clandestine routes, what would become known as the Underground Railroad, to reach Timbuctoo. With such a concentration of fugitives from enslavement, the residents endured all too frequent incursions by slave catchers, who either bought a slave running, arrived with an arrest warrant to recover a runaway for the owner, or sought to kidnap a victim and sell him or her to a slave trader for a fast profit. There are several harrowing accounts of such incursions that have survived the passage of time, including the 1836 capture of Nathaniel Meade, the 1847 detention of Perry and Noah Hinson and Rachel Pine, and the 1860 Battle of Pine Swamp. The last noted action occurred 10 years after Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which granted federal law enforcement the right of seizure. At the center of virtually all these cases was a Philadelphia-based slave catcher named George F. Alberti. Empowered at an early age as a Moyamensing constable, Alberti used his official capacity almost exclusively in capturing fugitives from slavery. He was the son and namesake of a Philadelphia physician who worked to save the city's population during the yellow fever epidemic of 1793. Tall, sinewy, and with a powerful frame, slave catcher Alberti had a vice-like grip, steely eyes, and a heart of ice. During his career, Alberti recovered more than 100 runaways for their owners down south. He occasionally engaged in outright kidnapping beginning as early as 1815. He had been shot several times in his work and finally spent 1 year of a 10-year sentence in Eastern State Penitentiary on a kidnapping conviction before the new Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, William Bigler, pardoned Alberti in 1852. During the fall of 1860, citizens residing in the local Burlington County black enclaves of Timbuctoo and nearby Clarksboro and Harrisburg caught glimpses of Alberti in their neighborhoods, accompanied by a former Timbuctoo resident named Caleb Wright. While living in Timbuctoo, Wright professed great piety and occasionally preached in the little frame church that sat at the edge of the burial ground along Church Street. But it appears Wright only sought to gain the confidence of the fugitives then living in the Timbuctoo community. By 1860, Wright resided in Philadelphia's second ward, the same ward as George Alberti's abode, suggesting that Wright worked for Alberti as a black spy. They visited the house of Elsie Jackson in Timbuktu early on a November Sunday morning, leaving there about daybreak. After sunset on the evening of Thursday, November 29, 1860, George Alberti and Caleb Wright departed from South Street, Philadelphia, on the Canes Point Ferry, in the company of several other men riding in 4 hackney coaches. Following their arrival in South Camden, the coaches traveled up Broadway, where Deputy U.S. Marshal Josiah Shivers and additional men joined the group. At 8:30 p.m., the caravan rode out the Moorestown and Camden Turnpike, today's Federal Street and Maple Avenue, for 9 or 10 miles to Moorestown, arriving a few minutes before 10 p.m. There they located Chester Township Constable Samuel Kelly, and employing a ruse, requested that he assist the group in serving a warrant, quote, against a colored man for stealing, end quote, in Morristown. Despite the late hour, the constable agreed, and he joined the other 11 men in the coaches. The vehicles traveled out Centerton Road, crossing Rancocas Creek using the Centerton Bridge, and followed Bridge Street up into Rancocas Village. There they entered the Beverly and Mount Holly Turnpike Company toll bridge and traveled eastwards towards Mount Holly. Shortly after passing Irish Road, the coaches clattered over the planks forming the small bridge at the eastern branch of Mill Brook, located about 1/2 mile west of Timbuctoo. And then they slowed as the drivers strained their eyes to find a small local road that led to Pine Swamp, an area of wetlands and pine groves between the headwaters of the eastern branch of Mill Brook and Grubb's Run. The latter stream runs just east of and parallel with Church Street in Timbuctoo. The hour was approaching 11 p.m., and the Simmons family was fast asleep in the tenant house of Quaker farmer Allen Fenimore. A laborer on the Fenimore farm, Perry Simmons had returned to his home at dusk. After making supper for her husband, Julia Simmons banked the fire. The couple's single-story tenant house, possibly a log cabin, contained 2 rooms and a narrow winding set of interior steps leading up to the garret. Perry and Julia had first arrived in the area of Timbuctoo between 1848 and 1850. The 1860 census records their nativity as Maryland, although some newspaper accounts have Perry listed as a fugitive from Virginia. While Perry, age 40, maintained his family in doing farm labor, Julia, age 39, worked as a laundress, taking in wash from nearby farms. During their time in New Jersey, Perry and Julia had 2 daughters, Rebecca Ann, age 9, and Mary May, age 8. The household also contained a servant woman named Araminta Hopkins, age 22. The lead driver suddenly spotted Pine Swamp Road and pulled on the reins to bring the horses left. The drivers picked their way up the roadway with the aid of the moonlight, which was only 1 day beyond the late November full moon. The sky had cleared earlier in the day after an extended nor'easter had struck and had moved away from the coast, causing the temperature to drop precipitously. The coaches finally arrived at the Fenimore tenant house just after 11 p.m., and the men congratulated themselves at finding their quarry so easily. Carrying weapons, handcuffs, and shackles, the 12 men felt well equipped to capture a fugitive slave or 2. After a quick exchange of instructions, Alberti led the men to the front door of the Simmons house. Likely using the butt of a gun, Alberti rapped on the door sharply, arousing the family. Without opening the door, Perry asked, "Who's there?" Alberti responded, "I have a warrant for the arrest of Perry Simmons for stealing chickens in Morristown." Knowing why these men had arrived in the middle of the night, Perry directed everyone in the household to pull their blankets and covers and retreat to the garret. He then responded very coolly through the door, "You cannot fool Perry Simmons with such a story as that," and he quickly retreated up the steps to protect his family. Armed with 2 loaded shotguns and a sharpened logging axe, Perry was prepared to defend himself and his family, even to the death. Knowing he had been duped, Chester Township Constable Kelly told Alberti he would have nothing to do with arresting Perry Simmons. He withdrew and began the 8-mile trek home on foot. He considered a long walk back to Morristown a better consolation than to remain and assist Alberti and his mob in enslaving a black man and his family. After Kelly departed, the men broke down the door of the house and entered to find the first floor empty. Realizing that the Simmons family had taken refuge in the garret, Alberti called up the steps for Simmons to surrender. Perry replied, "Never while I live." Although the Simmons family was in a state of high agitation and anxiety, Perry remained cool, resolute, and undaunted. He told the men below that he would shoot the first one that dared to climb the steps. Alberti, or one of the other men, discharged 2 pistols loaded only with powder up the stairs in an effort to intimidate Perry, but to no avail. Later, Alberti started up the steps, but when he saw the barrel of Perry's gun closely pointed at his head, he reportedly returned back down the stairs without touching any of the treads, literally jumping to the first floor in great haste. Feeling the biting cold, the raiders finally retreated from the house and built a fire outside to warm themselves. Perry's family remained huddled under their bed covers for warmth and for protection, while he stood guard at the top of the steps. The cold in the unheated garret caused him to shiver uncontrollably at times, but Perry never left his post. He and the family took turns yelling, "Murder! Kidnappers!" throughout the early mornings in an effort to gain the attention of nearby farmers like Daniel Jeffress or the Fenimores. The men warming by the fire continued to construct schemes on how to capture Perry Simmons. Finally, at about 6:30 p.m. on Friday, November 30th, 22-year-old Alan Fenimore Jr. came out of his family home to attend to chores in the stable. Hearing the now hoarse cries of "Kidnappers! Kidnappers!" he looked towards the Simmons house and noticed the coaches. He ran over to the house to inquire about the activities there, but Alberti told him to leave immediately. Alan Fenimore did as he was told, but instead of returning home, he struck out across the farm fields for Timbuctoo, 3/4 of a mile away. Upon crossing the Mount Holly and Rancocas Turnpike and reaching Church Street, he started yelling, "Kidnappers at Perry Simmons! Kidnappers at Perry Simmons!" The residents of Timbuctoo began to stir with the commotion, and David Parker, the community leader known locally as King David, quickly assembled a brigade armed with knives, guns, and axes. Parker then led his troopers at a quick pace northward across the Rancocas Turnpike and toward Perry Simmons' house. King David's army yelled all the way across the fields in an effort to scare off Alberti and his gang, which had the desired results. The slave catchers mounted their coaches and departed the Simmons house in a great cloud of dust. 3 miles away, early risers in Rancocas village reported seeing the vehicles racing through, while the drivers whipping the horses for more speed. Such was their fear of King David Parker and his army. Rumors circulated that another attempt would be made to recover Perry Simmons, but Alberti, now age 70, retired from slave catching following this failed mission, a fitting end to such an ignoble career. Alberti lived for another 9 years before his death in July of 1869. He outlived Perry Simmons by 7.5 years. Perry never recovered from spending that night in the unheated garret and succumbed to the effects of his exposure during the early part of February 1862. He was likely interred at the burial ground in Timbuctoo. It is unclear where Julia and the 2 daughters went following Perry's demise, but they did not remain resident in West Hampton Township. Araminta Hopkins, the caretaker, the housekeeper, was living with Louis Armstrong by 1870. Today, the Tarnsfield development north of Rancocas Road sits on a large portion of what was Pine Swamp and the site of the Fenimore tenant house. Despite never having the opportunity to wear the uniform of the United States colored troops during the Civil War, Perry Simmons most assuredly stood on the front line in the battle to end slavery in this nation. When the roll is called up yonder, Perry will assemble on heaven's parade ground with his brothers in blue. On orders, he will dress right and then gladly and proudly proclaim, "Soldier Perry Simmons, ready for duty." That's our first story. Now we'll move into our second one. This is the story of Thomas Haines Dudley and the recovery of the Johnson family. On a warm Thursday evening in September 1845, a group of strangers from Maryland, led by William Chance and riding in 2 wagons, pulled up in front of the Green Tree Tavern in Evesham Township. They ordered meals for themselves and feed for their horses. They indicated to Mr. Bodine, the tavern keeper, they would not retire to beds. Rather, they would spend the night at the table in the tavern, as they intended to leave early in the morning. After some belabored entreaties, Bodine convinced the men to take a room. True to their word, the men had the horses harnessed and hooked to the wagons and departed from the tavern about daybreak. The men drove out Green Tree Road to what we know today as Mount Laurel, where they turned left and went over the mount, passing the Friends Meeting House on the right and the Friends School on the left. As the wagons topped the rise on Morristown Mount Laurel Road and traveled down the hill, the men quickly came to a stop before reaching Union Mill Road and pulled up in front of a small hamlet known as Petersburg. The settlement hardly comprised more than 5 or 6 dwellings belonging to those people who passed themselves off as free blacks. Among the residents there was a former slave from Maryland named Jefferson Johnson, who lived in Petersburg with his wife Maria and their 5 children, Henry, age 12, Rachel Ann, age 9, Hester Ann, age 7, Alexander, age 4, and Susan, age 16 months. When the strangers arrived, Jefferson and his son, Henry, had already left the house, probably to work on a nearby farm. Likewise, Rachel Ann was also gone from her home, as she likely worked as a domestic in a neighbor's house. The strangers questioned the remaining 3 children concerning the whereabouts of their mother. Children told the men that she was working at the farm of Mr. Beck. The men climbed back into their wagons and, using the directions the children provided, traveled over to Mr. Beck's farm. The men spotted Maria milking a cow in the barnyard. They jumped from their wagons, ran to Maria, seized her, and dragged her bodily to one of the wagons. Mr. Beck stopped the men and inquired, "What do you think you're doing?" The men responded, "This woman is our property, our slave, and we have come to reclaim her." They failed, however, to provide any proof to the inquisitor. Farmer Beck was so emotionally overwrought with what the men said that he failed in making any attempt to stop them from carrying out their dastardly deed. The men drove off from Beck's farm at top speed with their prisoner, leaving Beck standing and shaking in the barnyard. The wagons returned to the Johnson house, where the men gathered up and kidnapped the 3 Johnson children, despite the fact their nativity had all occurred in New Jersey and they were born free. As one newspaper reported, the men pitched them into the wagons like calves for market. The men then put whip to their horses and escaped to the dominion of slavery, passing by the Green Tree through Ellisburg, Haddonfield, and on to the Camden ferries without stopping. If you think this was the end of Maria Johnson and her children, you would be wrong. A young Quaker man who had grown up in the neighborhood named Thomas Haines Dudley, age 26, had known the Johnson family most of his life. At the time of the kidnapping, Dudley had just passed the bar examination to become an attorney. He returned to his room in a Camden boarding house, despairing of his future since he had not a single client. A sudden sharp rap on the door interrupted Dudley's pity party, and when he opened the door, he found the august Mr. Benjamin B. Cooper standing there. Cooper, a farmer from Waterford Township and a known abolitionist, engaged Dudley for a, quote, for a case of which there were perhaps few men able or willing to undertake, from its difficulty and danger, in which all the instincts of humanity require a speedy action, end quote. Cooper told Dudley that members of the Religious Society of Friends in Burlington County had held a hasty special meeting in Morristown and collectively subscribed $1,000 in gold to redeem Maria and her children. Mr. Cooper, who had attended that meeting, told those gathered that he knew a man who had just passed the bar, whose sympathies were with the abolitionists, and above all possessed the energy and determination necessary, who also knew besides the captives, as the woman had often worked on his mother's farm when he was a child. Thomas Dudley accepted Cooper's case and the ransom money and prepared to head south, donning the garb of a slave trader, including a large, broad-brimmed hat, a pair of pistols stuck in his belt, and carrying a whip. Dudley headed into enemy territory after the 2 wagons. Despite the rather lengthy head start the slave catchers held, Dudley soon learned that the men had tied up at a hotel in Head of Elk, Maryland, for the night. He presented himself to them and indicated he was buying slaves to take farther south. No transaction occurred during the initial meeting with the kidnappers, but Dudley did overhear a plan by several men to rob him. The would-be robbers, assuming Dudley carried a great deal of cash as a slave trader. So Thomas spent the entire night in the hotel dining room, Sitting in a chair backed up to a corner, he drew up a table in front of him and laid his 2 pistols on the table. No one bothered to molest him during the night. The next morning, the negotiations proceeded for Maria and her youngest child, Susan. The slave catchers had already sold Hester Ann to a woman in Baltimore and Alexander to a slave auctioneer. To maintain his cover as a slave trader, Dudley treated Maria roughly, and she failed to recognize him as an old friend. Maria considered Thomas to be the slave trader he purported to be. He ordered Maria and Susan to be locked up until he could prepare to leave. Maria, overcome with fear and emotion, reluctantly followed with Susan in tow when Dudley departed head of elk. Initially, he headed farther south in an attempt to deceive the kidnappers, but then he turned north and traveled to Wilmington, Delaware, where the trio boarded a steamboat for Philadelphia. Once aboard the steamer, Thomas turned to Maria and said, "Don't you know me?" She replied, "Oh, I want to." Dudley then said, "Don't you remember Nancy Dudley's little boy, Tom, who used to play pranks on the cows you milked at Evesham and make them kick the pail over?" Her fears instantly melted, and her face reflected the joy of seeing a friend behind the guise of a slave trader. Dudley told her she and Susan were headed home, and the happiness she felt could not be contained. Of the other 2 children sold in Baltimore, a sale advertisement for Alexander appeared in the newspaper, and Thomas Dudley succeeded in buying him for $90 before the auction occurred. Despite attempts to also purchase Hester Ann from the woman who acquired her, she initially remained separated from the family. Mention of Dudley's daring deeds appeared in William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. Quote, "The West Jersey abducted slaves. Several benevolent gentlemen of West Jersey, regarding the late abduction of the wife of Jefferson Johnson with her 3 children, all born in New Jersey, as an outrage upon humanity and law, interested themselves to discover the perpetrators and rescue the victims. We learn from the Camden Mail that they have succeeded in recovering one of the children, and it is added, quote, "We are not at liberty to go into the particulars, but may state that one child, a boy of 10 years old, has been brought back with money advanced by an individual, and that efforts are being made which will lead to the recovery of the poor woman and the other children. $90 was paid for the boy, and a considerable additional sum will be needed to redeem the mother and other children. An appeal is made to the benevolent in their behalf," end quote. Then in February 1847 edition of the Camden Mail newspaper, an article appeared concerning Hester Ann. The piece reported, quote, "The old lady who bought her in Baltimore when the stolen family were conveyed has recently deceased. After providing for the manumission of the child in her will, agreeably to a promise made at the time of her purchase, this completes the restoration of the whole family." End quote. After Jefferson and Maria Johnson reunited, the couple added 2 more children to their family, Jefferson Jr. and Beulah. The family continued to live in Petersburg through at least 1876. With his work completed for the Johnson family, Thomas Haines Dudley went on to become a highly respected and successful attorney in Camden. But as often said, no good deed goes unpunished. On Saturday night, March 15th, 1856, Thomas was on board the ferry boat New Jersey, returning from Philadelphia to his home in Camden, preparing to pass through the canal that separated Smith and Windmill Islands. Suddenly, fire erupted from the ferry's engine room while the boat was in the middle of the Delaware River. Surrounding ice floes made it difficult for the panicked passengers to leave the stricken vessel and would-be rescuers to reach the people. Dudley watched in horror as men and women, their clothes fully engulfed in flames, jumped into the river, only to be struck and injured or killed by the still turning paddle wheel. Dudley removed his overcoat and threw it in the water in an attempt to sink deep into the river and avoid the revolving paddle. He succeeded in his original goal just as the boat had become completely engulfed with flames. After surfacing, he quickly found some smaller ice floes that offered him limited support to keeping him afloat. He remained in the water for 1.5 hours. When rescuers finally pulled him into a rowboat, the occupants presumed him dead. They rode to the Arch Street Wharf in Philadelphia, where ready hands gently lifted his still form from the boat and carried him into a nearby hotel, which the city officials pressed into service as a makeshift morgue. Mr. Albert S. Martley, a director with the Camden Amboy Railroad, walked through the death chamber and recognized the face of his good friend, Thomas Dudley. Kneeling down and drawing close to Dudley's face, Martley detected shallow breathing, and he immediately summoned aid to resuscitate Thomas. Efforts to return Dudley to a state of consciousness were intensive and lengthy, but in due time he came around and began to rally to the aid. The emotional strain of witnessing the death and destruction around him while on the ferry, combined with the lasting effects of the frigid river water upon his body, remained with him for the rest of his life, often suffering intense pain or bouts of depression. Nonetheless, he continued as a successful attorney and stayed active in many public affairs. Thomas Dudley strongly supported Abraham Lincoln during the 1860 election, all the while remaining steadfast in his abolitionist beliefs. As a reward for his support, Lincoln dispatched Dudley to Liverpool, England, as the American consul during the Civil War. While there, he gained much intelligence about the blockade runners constructed in England, as well as British shipments of war materiel to the Confederate States. Dudley became known as Lincoln's spy master, as he managed many intelligence agents across England, gathering information to keep the Union forces aware of British support for the Confederacy. When Dudley returned from England after the war ended, he resumed his active public life. He survived until 1893, when he died in Philadelphia of a massive heart attack at Broad Street Station, Philadelphia, while waiting for a train. A tragic end to a fulfilling life. Thank you for your kind attention. That's all, folks.